This morning, we're looking at a very special time in Jesus' life and his story. Step by step, Matthew unfolds the story of Jesus. He begins by showing us how Jesus was born into this world. He goes on to show us, at least by implication, that Jesus had to perform faithfully his duties to his home before he began on his duty to the world. That he had to show himself faithful in the smaller tasks before God gave to him the greatest task in the world. Matthew goes on with the story of Jesus' life to show us how, with the emergence of John the Baptist, Jesus knew that the clock had struck his hour, that the time had come to enter upon his work. Matthew shows us Jesus identifying himself with a people's unprecedented search for God. In that moment, he shows us Jesus' realization that he was indeed chosen one of God, but that his way to victory lay through the cross. His disciples didn't want to hear that. We know that. They spoke against it. They fought against it. They didn't want Jesus to die. That just wasn't in their plan at all. But we know that this was in God's plan. So if any person has a vision, as Jesus had, the immediate problem is how to turn that vision into a fact, right? How do we turn that vision into a fact? We have to find some way to turn the dream into a reality. And we need a lot of prayer, even as Lorraine mentioned this morning, coming from our prayer director, Carla. How was Jesus to do it? What method was he to adopt? Was he to adopt the method of a mighty conqueror coming in on a white charger, right? That's what they wanted. That's what the Jews were expecting in their Messiah, right? That he would come in as a conquering king, right? On a white horse with a great sword, and that he would take out the Romans who were their oppressors. Or was he to adopt the method of patient, sacrificial, unconditional love? That was the problem which Jesus faced in his temptations. The task had been committed into his hands. What method was he to choose to work out the task which God had given him to do? Now, I think right off the bat in this passage, there's one thing that we need to focus on, that we need to note. And Mary and the kids did it so wonderfully this morning. That very first word that Mary held up, test. See, there's something here that's so important as we study the temptation of Jesus, and that's the meaning of the word to tempt. In the Greek, this word doesn't mean what we think it means. I mean, in the English, the word tempt has a uniformly and a consistently bad meaning. It always means to entice someone to do wrong, to seek, maybe to seduce them into sin, to try to persuade a person to take the wrong way. But the Greek word has a totally different element in its meaning. It means to test far more than it means to tempt in our sense of the word. Now, this is a great truth, and it's a really uplifting truth. The other night, I went to a seminar and a dinner program, and I met a man named Scott Burrows. You may have seen him on television. I'd heard of him before. I'd never read his books or heard him speak for any length of time. Scott is a quadriplegic. And he does seminars and workshops to try to help people through their times of testing, right? Their struggles in life, which we all go through, to try to help people to face those testings courageously. Scott just kind of blew me right out of the water. I mean, as a pastor, I've had the privilege of ministering to many quadriplegics and paraplegics over the years. And of course, the hope that they've had, many of them have had such hope that they would someday in this life and in this world be able to get out of the wheelchair, right? And to walk. I've never seen that happen, right? And as Scott was sharing his story, it became obvious that he was building up to something very powerful. Now, Scott was a champion football player. He was a college football player for Florida State before his accident. He was a champion martial arts person. And they showed some videos, of some of his sports activities and what he was able to do. And one of the sports activities, he was doing martial arts, and he was up against a pretty large guy, right? And they were going at it. And all of a sudden, Scott just knocked this guy out. I mean, boom. And he was gone, right? And down on the floor. So you knew that Scott was used to really calling on himself, to perform, to use everything inside himself in his sports and athletics and those accomplishments. Scott shared this story. He shared about the struggles of being in an accident, a car accident. He was with his friends. They were young people down on the beach in Florida and having a wonderful time, and a little too much alcohol. And they were sent off to get some more wood for the big bonfire because they were going to be up all night. And so he went with his friend, and his friend was really inebriated. And he said, I never should have gone with them. But we went in the truck to go get more wood, and he rolled the truck, and they were really hurt, or he was really hurt. His friend was barely hurt at all. And Scott ended up in the hospital and was told that he would never walk again. And he was a quadriplegic. He wouldn't believe the doctor. He just wouldn't believe it. He wouldn't accept it. And finally, in fact, his father said, I have to get you another doctor. I want you to keep that attitude, that positive attitude that you have. And to see this as a time of testing, a time of struggle, but you're going to come through it stronger. You're going to come through it with such strength. And I don't know what that's going to look like, as Dad said, but I'm going to get you another doctor that's not going to tell you that you'll never walk again, that's not going to get any better pretty much than this. And so his dad got him another doctor, and time went on, and life went on, and he kept doing the therapy that he could do. And gradually he started to get some feeling back, and he got feeling back in his arms and his hands. And he was talking, and as he was sharing a story with us, he was getting very excited. And I could tell, honestly, I thought, man, oh man, I'm expecting him to just walk out of that chair. That's how powerful it was, and the energy that was in the place. Everybody felt it. And honestly, as he continued, I saw him start to move. He put his hands down on the arms of the wheelchair, and he started to push himself forward. And I thought, oh my God, he's going to try to get up. Now I'd never seen him except for on TV just a little bit, and then I'd heard of him, but I'd never heard this about him. And all of a sudden, folks, he stood up. He stood up out of that wheelchair. And not only did he stand up, he had a golf club up on the stage that he used as a prop. Well, it turned out that he used that golf club. He uses it as a cane. Now, this wasn't the first time he did this, right? But he stood up and he began to walk across the stage. Well, it was just absolutely it was a powerful, powerful moment, right? And then Scott went on to explain to us that every spinal injury is different. And that he was it was a miracle, there's no doubt about it, and he acknowledged that, right? But out of that miracle, he has been able to help so many others to call upon those inner resources, to go through times of testing, and to realize that this doesn't have to be the end. It doesn't have to be the end. Now, this is a great and an uplifting truth found in this scripture this morning. What we call temptation is not meant to make us sin. It is meant to enable us to conquer. It is not meant to make us bad. In fact, it's meant to make us good. It's through the struggles of life that we are able to become the people that God has called us to be. We know that that's a lifelong journey, that we never arrive in this life, and that we all have a long way to go on that path. But Jesus is showing us here that this temptation, that we call it, this testing, it's not meant to weaken us. It's meant to strengthen us, to make us stronger. It's not the penalty of being a human being. In fact, it's the glory of being a human being. It's the test which comes to a person whom God wishes to use. So then, we need to think of this whole incident not so much as a tempting as the testing of Jesus, right? The glory of our testing is that we have the power of free will. Wow. We note that Jesus went out into the wilderness, led by the Spirit, and went out into a place. Wow, the wilderness is a good name for it, folks. It stretches over an area of 35 by 15 miles, and it's called devastation. The hills are like dust heaps. The limestone is blistered and peeling. Rocks are bare and jagged. Often the very ground sounds hollow when a foot or a horse's hoof falls upon it. It glows and shimmers with heat like some vast furnace. Jesus followed the Holy Spirit to this place. He chose to be there. He chose to be alone with God. I know that a lot of us go wrong in this very thing. We never want to be alone, you know. We never want to be alone. We never want to be quiet with God, right? Just be alone with God and with the Holy Spirit. There are times when no one else's advice is any good to us, right? There are times when we need to stop acting and we need to wait on God. It may be that we make many a mistake because we do not give ourselves a chance just to be alone with God. Now, I know that all of the testings that we go through in life do not always turn out like they did for Scott Burrows. We had another young fella that we lost this week from our recovery ministry, a wonderful young guy with a young wife and children and a family that loved him. And he struggled so hard to get sober, right? He struggled and struggled and struggled. And he would have some success. And he came here and got help from us and from our recovery ministry. And then he went off, and his family spent a lot of money to send him to one of the most expensive treatment centers in Canada. And they thought that would really make the difference. This was going to help him, and he thought that this would make the difference. And so he was gone for a month, and then he came back, and in his testing, and his struggle, his addiction took him from us this week, right? And so we know that not all testings have that amazing positive result that we see in the life of a Scott Burrows. We know that along with the testing comes that possibility of loss, of brokenness, right? Of great sorrow. We know that that's the life that we live, that that's what free will is all about. We have the freedom to choose. That's the glory of being a human being. We have free will. All three of the gospel writers seem to stress the immediacy with which the temptations followed the baptism of Jesus. It says the Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness. This was immediate. This was in God's plan. It was urgent. It needed to happen right now. And for Jesus, he needed to be alone with God. And as we think of Lent, as we think of these 40 days, we think of Jesus spending that time alone with God and the struggle that he went through. Now, you know, the experience that's described here, this isn't a physical outward experience that is described. It's a struggle, a test that went on in Jesus' own heart and mind, just like we struggle with what is right, with what we should do and what we shouldn't do, right? The proof is of teaching is that there's no possible mountain from which all the kingdoms of the earth could be seen. This is describing an inner struggle. It's through our inmost thoughts and desires that the tempter comes to us. His attack is launched in our minds, right? It's launched in our minds. As Juan Carlos Ortiz said, it has so much to do with what's going on between our ears, right? Between our ears. Our prayers are often answered between our ears. Bless Juan. So we don't want to think of this testing then, that Jesus conquered the temptation, the tempter, once and for all. It's so similar to so many of us that are working a spiritual program in our lives, maybe a recovery program in our lives. We realize that it's one moment at a time, right? We don't get to the place where we've arrived, where we've finished the journey, not in this life. So we must not think that this is in one testing that Jesus conquered the tempter of his soul forever and ever, that the tempter never came to him again. We know that isn't true. We see it, the tempter come to him. And the truth is that eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. In our Christian warfare, there's no release. We don't get to the end of it in this life. We never arrive. From the beginning to the end of the day, Jesus had to fight his battle. That's why he can help us to fight ours. I think one thing that stands out here, you can never really read this story without remembering its source. Must have been Jesus himself. He was alone in the wilderness. And so the source of this story is Jesus himself. He must have told this story, told them what happened while he was in the wilderness to his disciples, right? No one can ever read the story without remembering that its source must have been Jesus himself. And I think when you come right down to it, this is Jesus laying bare his inmost heart and soul. He's sharing his deepest feelings, right? His deepest thoughts, his deepest struggles with Matthew and his disciples here. He's telling us what he went through. So this passage is one of the most sacred of all the stories of Jesus. For in it, Jesus is saying to us that he can help others who are tempted because he himself was tempted. We do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who relates to us in every way, Hebrews tells us. And so you can never read the story without realizing just how Jesus struggled, how he himself was tempted. And he draws the veil from his own struggles to help us in our struggle. And I guess the one struggle in this passage that I wanted to share with us this morning, because we're going to be receiving communion in just a little bit, is the temptation here to turn the stones into bread. The desert was littered. I remember Diane telling me about that she noticed the stones and how they looked like loaves of bread. I noticed that as well, and I had mentioned it to her when she was going to the Holy Land. It's littered with round pieces of limestone rock, which were exactly like little loaves of bread. So they would even suggest this temptation to Jesus, to turn the stones into bread. He was so hungry, right? 40 days and 40 nights. So this was really a double temptation. It was a temptation to Jesus to use his power selfishly and for his own use. And that is precisely what Jesus always refused to do. There's always the temptation to use selfishly whatever powers God has given to us. God has given every person a gift. And every person can ask one of two questions. We can ask, what can I make for myself out of this gift? Or what can I do for others with this gift? This kind of temptation can come out in the simplest thing. There's no person who will not be tempted to use selfishly the gift which God has given them. But there was another side to this temptation. Jesus was God's Messiah, and he knew it. In the wilderness, he was facing the choice of a method whereby he could win people to God, right? He could have a great impact to win them to God. What method was he to use for the task which God had given him to do? How was he to turn the vision into actuality and the dream into fact? One sure way to persuade people to follow him was to feed them, give them bread, even as God gave them manna in the wilderness. Had not God given his people manna? Had God not said, I will rain bread from heaven on you? Did not the visions of the future golden age include that very dream? Had not Isaiah said, they shall not hunger or thirst? And so, this was the promise that they were waiting on, that we're going to be fed, we're going to be looked after, right? But that wasn't it. First, it would have been to bribe them to follow him. It would have been to persuade them to follow him for the sake of what they could get out of it. And so the reward Jesus had to offer, though, was a cross, a path of discipleship, right? Which was about the cross. Second, it would have been to remove the symptoms without dealing with the actual disease. People are hungry, but the question is, why? Why are they hungry? Is it because of our own foolishness and our own shiftlessness and our own carelessness? Is it because there are some who selfishly possess too much while others possess too little? The real way to cure hunger, to remove the causes, and these causes are in our souls, right? And above all, I think there's a hunger of the heart, which is not in material things to satisfy. They just don't have that power. So Jesus answered the tempter in the very words which express the lesson which God had sought to teach the people in the wilderness. Man does not live by bread alone, but that man lives by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord. The only way then to true satisfaction is the way which is learned complete surrender and dependence on God. And we this morning share that reality that Jesus himself is the bread of the world. He is the bread of life that we share. And